Well, thank you for joining me again as we meander our way through Hebrews over these weeks. Hebrews chapter 11. We're looking at the by faith passages and the way in which they speak to us, and drawing them from what we've done on Sunday. So on Sunday, we looked at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 to 10, and we're just building on that now. So let me read Hebrews 11, verse 9, which speaks about Abraham. It says, by faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob. Now, Lynn and I are not campers. We've never spent a night under canvas and have no real desire to do so. I know some people are very keen about it. It brings you back to nature and closer to the real world and all that. But I spent too many days, weeks, let's say in the Lake District, under the rain, thinking, I'm glad we've got somewhere that's going to be dry when we get back this afternoon. Thinking about the campers in the waterlogged grounds in which they are attempting to live. So no, it doesn't appeal to us. So I guess I have some kind of sympathy for Abraham. Abraham, the man whom God called out of the security of the city into the insecurity of following God, and doing so living in tents. It says that he spent the whole of his life, once he was called, in a tent. And that was 100 years, if you want to know how long it was. And I'm sure he was glamping it because he was a rich man. But nevertheless, I do have some sympathy. But sympathy aside, the idea of Abraham living in a tent is instructive for us, because Abraham is, if you like, the first of the following disciples God calls, and we have the example of what it meant for him to follow. And therefore it says something to us about that he lived in a tent. You see, when you get to the New Testament, you get to, let's say, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 13. Peter describes his own body as a tent. He talks about whilst he is in the tent of the body, he will seek to remind them of the truths that he's taught, because he knows that the time is coming very shortly when he's going to die. In other words, put the tent aside. That's what he says. Now, Paul has more to say about the tent in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And he there describes the tent in these terms. He says, we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. So he's talking about the human body as a tent, but he's contrasting it with something far more secure and substantial. The earthly tent we have, he says, may be destroyed. But by contrast, what we have is a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. And the contrast is powerful and clear. The body we have is frail and vulnerable. Like the tent, it can be uprooted and taken away in a moment. Whereas what God gives us through Jesus is something far more secure, far more substantial, a house, a solid building from God that's in heaven, away from all the threats that we face in this world, that is eternal. It's not going to collapse just like the tent can. And it's not built by human hands. It's not our own construction. It's God's, and therefore it's far more reliable. Now, I'm sure there are things we can say about that. Notice from Paul's words how he speaks about this life in the tent. It's in chapter 5, verse 4. He says, while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened. That's the cynic's view of life, isn't it, really? That's life. We groan. And of course, it's true. Life is tough. There are insecurities and worries. If we're not worried for ourselves, we might be worried for somebody else. There's pain. Things happen, and we wish they hadn't. And these things make us long for something better. In fact, that's what they do. In chapter 5, verse 2, using a similar phrase again, He says, meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. That's the house from God he's speaking about. The pains and the troubles we experience are like signposts. They tell us there's something greater. They indicate we are longing for something better, something for eternity, something that will last, something that will give a foundation. Of course, the foundation is in Christ himself, knowing him, because he's defeated death. That's why the security is there that isn't there for us. Our bodies are frail and mortal, and we can see them as we age, wasting away. But in Christ, we have an eternal home. That's why the Christian life has a solid foundation to it. That's why it talks about building on the rock. That's why in Hebrews 11, it talks about Abraham looking ahead to the city with foundations. Well, that we long for that. We groan for that. And that means that actually we are travelers in this world. That's how we're to view ourselves. We're not home yet. C.S. Lewis has a wonderful illustration, and I think it's in one of the chapters in The Problem of Pain. He says that we go through life with all its difficulties and joys, like travelers, and every so often we stay at an inn or a hotel. And he says that's like us. As we go through life, God gives us pleasant places, pleasant things, good things, happy things. Well, it could just be a friendship. It could be a pleasant walk. We see a wonderful view, a sunset. He even talks about a bathe. That's the 1950s term for something really enjoyable, apparently. But he says all of these help us on our journey. Perhaps just little things, sometimes bigger things. Just like the traveller comes across a pleasant inn to stay for the night. So they're good things that keep us going. But none of them's good enough to make us think that we've arrived home, because we haven't. The image of the tent dweller is somebody who is not at home, somebody who has not arrived at their permanent dwelling place. Like Abraham, he was longing for the city with foundations, so he lived in a tent until he got that. And like Abraham, therefore, we live with the insecurity and frailty of the human body that we're traveling through. We're looking ahead to the eternal city and our eternal home. We're not there yet, but we will be. Now, tomorrow, we're going to take the idea of this tent a bit further, because I want to talk about the tent that Jesus lived in. And I'll see you tomorrow.